This video is sponsored by SimpliSafe. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Most of us are used to a world where we feel free to go about our daily lives, going to work, school, and spending time with family in the comfort of our own homes. Hopefully in communities where neighbors look out for one another and we feel safe with the people around us. We know it's impossible to truly understand the intentions of everyone we encounter throughout the day and even what's going on behind someone's eyes. But sometimes you never know who's watching you. And for one family who had everything to live for, this is what they were about to discover in a way they could have never imagined. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. And if you've never been here before, I am Kimbyrleigha. Nice to finally meet you. Just give me one moment to thank our sponsor for today, and that is SimpliSafe. And there's no safe like SimpliSafe. It's really important for us to protect things and, of course, the people that we love. Watching as much true crime as we do, we know how important it is to be aware of our surroundings and to ensure we are as safe as possible. For as long as I can remember, my father had a security system installed in our home. So home safety and security was instilled in me from a young age, and I've carried that mentality throughout my life, thankfully, because in college, there were a string of burglaries in my townhome complex, and all the units on my side were broken into except for mine. And that's because I took measures to ensure a potential criminal knew that my home was armed and secured. Today, there are even more options to do so, and that's where SimpliSafe comes in. Technology has come a long way, and SimpliSafe has options for your entire home, from advanced sensors and indoor and outdoor cameras to ways to help protect you from threats of break-ins, fires, floods, and more. It's the 24/7 professional monitoring that also makes a huge difference in feeling safe, because I know that SimpliSafe agents are on standby and ready to react in the event that I experience an emergency, whether or not I'm at home. They can quickly respond and assess a situation within 5 seconds of receiving an alert, and then they can reach out to first responders. SimpliSafe is also an award-winning home security system that's been named one of the best home security systems of 2024 by US News and World Report, and that's why I chose SimpliSafe to secure our home. The agents can actually see and speak with me or even an intruder in real time, and with a baby on the way, I can only imagine what I'm going to be worrying about. But knowing that there's someone there to help me anytime I need them makes me feel safe. It's also easy to install by yourself. John set up our keyless smart lock and alarm keypad to arm the system, but if you do need help, a SimpliSafe certified technician will come set up your system for you. And then everything can be controlled and monitored right from the app. I set up the indoor camera in our bedroom so that I can make sure our dogs are okay when we leave the house. It took me probably 2 minutes to have it up and running, and I love using the SimpliSafe app to check on my dogs throughout the day when I'm not there. I also think it's great that the SimpliSafe motion sensor detects intruders but not pets, because it's designed to know the difference. So if the alarm goes off, you can be confident that it's real. They've got so many options, from sensors for doors and windows, glass break sensors, outdoor wireless cameras, video doorbells, and so much more. There's no safe like SimpliSafe, so check them out at the link below and save 20% on your system, and your first month is free when you sign up for Fast Protect monitoring at simplisafe.com/Kimber. Thanks so much to SimpliSafe for supporting this channel and making today's video possible. I want to start off by telling you about Diane Grant. Diane Ruth Grant was born in 1963 and grew up in the town of Estill in Hampton County, South Carolina. Diane's mom, Sarah Bowen, was only a teenager at the time that Diane was born, so Diane was raised by her father's family. They lived in a very tight-knit community of just over 1,800 people at the time. It's one of those places where everyone knew one another. Unfortunately, there isn't much that I was able to find about Diane's childhood or her adolescence, but I do try my very best. But from what I could tell, she was much loved by her extended family. Diane was known for being quiet and reserved, but she was a warm and generous person with strong family values. She spent a lot of her time in the nearby towns of Gifford and Scotia, just a 10-minute drive away. And these places were even smaller than the town she grew up in. They were home to just several hundred people. When Diane was in her late teens, she started dating a man from Gifford named Willie Lee DeVore, who was around her same age. The couple welcomed their first son, Marquise, in 1982 when Diane was 19 years old, and it appears the couple went on to get married. The day after Christmas, December 26, in 1987, 24-year-old Diane gave birth to a second son that they named Jatavius. Then on July 16, 1992, Diane and Willie's daughter was born, a little girl they named Deanna. Diane, of course, loved all of her children equally, but when Deanna came along, she was thrilled to finally have a daughter, a mini-me that she could dress up and one day look forward to all sorts of mother-daughter bonding activities that would cultivate a deep and loving relationship between girls and their mothers. Marquise was a very protective older brother, and Jatavius was his best friend. The boys felt even more protective of their sister Deanna, because she was the baby of the family and also because she was a girl. The parenting dynamic in the DeVore household was one that many of us can probably relate to. Willie was your classic, easygoing, fun dad, while Diane was the one who kept the kids in line, but always in a positive and loving manner. By this time, Diane had been in touch with other people from her past, one whom she had never known even existed. As I mentioned, Diane had been raised by her father's family, but in her early 20s, she decided she wanted to reconnect with her mother, Sarah, who lived out in New York. With the pair communicating once again, Diane got a huge surprise when her mother told her she had a brother that was 1 year older than she was, and he lived out in Connecticut. Diane could not believe this. The news was a shock in a lot of ways, but it was also an unexpected opportunity for her to get to know someone with whom she shared DNA and hopefully forge a close bond. This is happening more and more with sites like 23andMe and Ancestry, and I always wonder if I have any unknown siblings out there somewhere. Let me know if you have any personal stories of reconnecting with a long-lost loved one. I would really love to know. But Diane got in touch with her brother, and they began gradually getting to know each other through emails and phone calls. They knew that one day, when they both felt comfortable, they would eventually meet. Sadly, around 1995, 32-year-old Diane and Willie's marriage came to an end. Marquise was 13, Jatavius was 7, and Deanna was just about 3 years old. Unlike so many couples where things become difficult and hostile and the parenting arrangements break down, Willie and Diane were different. They managed to co-parent really successfully. Their kids were still so young, so they knew the most important thing was staying amicable and keeping disruption with the kids' lives as minimal as possible, ensuring they felt happy, safe, and loved at all times. They thought just because things didn't work out between them as a couple, this in no way meant they weren't 100% committed to being the best parents they could. Marquise, Jatavius, and Deanna split their time between 2 different households, but this in no way diminished how loved they felt by their parents. The 5 of them were still a strong family unit, even if Willie and Diane were no longer in a romantic relationship. Now, also dealing with the challenge of a changed financial situation in addition to being a single mom, Diane often worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and provide the best life she could for her kids, whether she was working at a florist, a plastic manufacturer company, or even a record company. At one stage in life, she commuted to work as a housekeeper in the resort destination of Hilton Head Island, something she couldn't have done had she not had the support of her extended family to help look after the kids. And of course, Diane was exceptionally grateful to have that network around her. Her coworkers at the plastics factory knew her as a go-getter, someone who was always busy and in 10 places at once. But she was also the kind of person who knew how to see the positive side of situations and overcome her hardships, no matter how tough they might be. Her childhood friend, Charles Hosendove, who attended school with Diane and went on to work with her at the plastics company, said that Diane was never really bothered by much. And if she wasn't the sort of person to make it known. In late 2001, 38-year-old Diane was presented with a new job opportunity, and she accepted a role at another manufacturing plant. Her coworkers threw her a farewell party. They were going to truly miss her professionalism, kindness, and of course her friendly face. And not everyone gets a farewell party when they leave a job, but Diane's new role wasn't in Gifford. It was actually 90 miles away in the city of North Charleston in Dorchester County. This is the southernmost part of South Carolina, in the heart of what's known as the Low Country and part of the broader Charleston metropolitan area. The first time that I was ever really introduced to the Low Country was when I was watching the Alec Murdaugh trial. So you may be familiar with this part of South Carolina if you followed that case. This is a historic, sprawling area, but it's one of the most poorest regions in the state, unfortunately. As the third largest city in South Carolina, North Charleston straddles the multiple counties of Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, where Diane and her youngest kids were going to move. The city, which is northwest of Charleston itself, is situated between two rivers, with the Ashley River to the west and the Cooper River to the east. North Charleston has a rich but complex history and cultural diversity among its residents. It was originally built off the exploitation of enslaved African people who arrived in the area via the slave trade. And over time, it continued to grow off the back of the agricultural industry. After its naval base was established in the turn of the 20th century, it also became home to a growing manufacturing and industrial sector. But of course, a lot had changed over the years, and in 2001, 38-year-old Diane, 14-year-old Jatavius, and 9-year-old Deanna made the move to see what awaited them. It was no doubt going to be tough for Diane, being a single mom and moving so far away from her support network. But she was up for the challenge, and she could see the opportunity was ultimately for the benefit of her children, with access to better education and better jobs. And even though they weren't moving out of state, it was no doubt a little bit scary and an uncertain time for the kids. North Charleston was home to over 81,000 people, way more than they were used to growing up in a very small town. The kids were also leaving behind everything they'd ever known, including their dad and their older brother Marquise, who is now 19. He decided to make an even bigger move, moving down to Florida on his own, and not long after arriving in Jacksonville, Marquise met a 19-year-old woman named Sonia, who would go on to become his wife. Sonia was hanging out having a meal with her dad when Marquise spotted her, and he was immediately struck by how beautiful Sonia was. Marquise introduced himself, and of course, Sonia probably thought he was just as good looking with his bright greenish blue eyes and olive skin. He definitely stood out in a crowd. They made a gorgeous couple, and soon they began seriously dating. And it wasn't long before he and Sonia fell in love. And after about a year together, they took the plunge and moved in with one another. Meanwhile, Diane and the younger children had moved into Archdale Forest apartment complex at 99 Shagbark Trail in North Charleston. The complex, which had on-site property management, consisted of 328 apartments and townhomes divided up into multiple larger buildings with around 5 dwellings to each building. Shagbark Trail looped around the complex, so the quiet wooded area had a cozy community feel where everyone looked out for one another. Kids hung out in the playground or by the pool or the picnic area, and people would wave to one another and walk their dogs. Residents felt really safe there, and there were minimal, if any, problems in terms of any criminal type of activity. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna quickly settled into their apartment, 213B. Diane worked hard at her new job to provide for her children and give them the best life she could. She was driven and intelligent, and despite working long hours, she put her kids first, and she took an immense amount of pride in herself, especially in her appearance. Even though she worked these long hours, she knew how to keep herself together. She always made it look effortless as well. She was very classy and beautiful. Around 2004, she took a new job in quality control at the Robert Bosch manufacturing plant, working second shift, which was great because it was only a 4-minute drive away from their home. The 40-year-old was soon a valuable and highly respected part of the team, and she stood out to her shift supervisor, Anthony Gilliard, who described Diane as a stellar performer. Diane was always friendly and helpful as a neighbor, and she instilled these same qualities in her children as well. They were always there to lend a hand to others. And this is exactly how Jatavius met a lot of people in his community, especially some of his closest friends. He was known as a bit of a class clown, but like his mom, he was kind and generous. And one day when Jatavius was driving home, he spotted his neighbor, 18-year-old Usha Mackey, walking around carrying a big laundry basket as she headed home. Jatavius pulled over, and he offered her a ride. And from then on, they were really, really close friends. Living so close to each other, they began hanging out regularly. Usha and Jatavius would either hang out at Diane's place or at another apartment nearby. And because the group didn't have to go far to walk home, it became quite usual for them to stay up well into the early hours of the morning, just talking and hanging out and spending time together. Deanna, meanwhile, was growing into a young woman and developing a solid sense of self, which we know can be difficult during those awkward teenage years. Unlike her mom, Deanna wasn't quiet. She was quite a chatterbox. Her grandmother, Sarah, described her as very outspoken, which made Deanna popular at school. She made friends easily, especially in the apartment complex, thanks to her outgoing personality and very sweet, respectful manner. One neighbor, Tia Thomas, thought of Deanna as his own daughter, given her close relationship with two of the Thomas girls, who would go roller skating together and play around the community. And as community-minded as Diane and her children were, they were definitely not the kind of neighbors to cause drama or to bother anyone. They didn't open the door to anyone they didn't know, but they were always there to help anyone who needed it. Now let's shift to what's happening down in Florida. Marquise and Sonia just welcomed their first child in 2002, a daughter. And then in 2005, Sonia gave birth to their son. And Diane was, of course, ecstatic. She was now a grandma, and she couldn't do enough for her oldest son's growing family. But it was also hard on Diane being states away from her grandchildren. Like many young parents, Marquise, who was employed by a trucking company, and Sonia both had to work to pay the bills. And when their children were old enough to go on a road trip to Diane's, she jumped at the opportunity. So in May of 2007, Diane drove down to Jacksonville, Florida, to pick up her grandkids and drive them back to South Carolina, where they would spend the entire summer with her and their Aunt Deanna and Uncle Jatavius. This would give Marquise and his wife a much-needed break to enjoy themselves as a couple. Sonia held her mother-in-law in high regard. She saw Diane as a very strong woman, a remarkable, elegant, strong mother who was very educated, and her beauty radiated from within. Diane really made a lasting impression on Sonia, and she actually aspired to be like her and emulate those same qualities one day. She, of course, trusted Diane with her children. And of course, Diane promised to call Sonia and Marquise every day so they could speak with their kids while they were away. That summer, life was good. And it was busy for 44-year-old Diane and her kids and now her grandkids. Even though it had been years since her move, she still called in to visit her former coworkers back in her hometown. And in early July, she and Deanna actually took a trip back to Gifford to visit Willie. But the hardworking single mom was about to mark an exciting and momentous milestone. Remember how I said that Diane had been in touch with her brother that she'd never met? Well, by now they agreed it was time to finally meet. Diane was super excited, and she looked forward to seeing her brother in the flesh for the very first time in the coming week. She figured that once her grandchildren had returned home to Florida after the summer, Diane had plans to go up and see her mom, Sarah, in New York. Deanna had visited her maternal grandmother the previous Thanksgiving, but Diane hadn't seen her mom in a while. By this time, 20-year-old Jatavius had moved out of the apartment, and he was enrolled in the Job Corps in Bamberg County. But in early July, he came to stay with his mom, his sister, his niece, and his nephew for a visit. And Diane was thrilled to have so many of her loved ones under the same roof. At the same time, 14-year-old Deanna was eagerly counting down the days to her 15th birthday. She loved taking her nephew for walks around the complex, pushing him along in his stroller and waving to people she knew along the way. She recently finished up at Oakbrook Middle School, where on the last day, her Principal Garland Crump, gave Deanna a hug and wished her luck in high school. Principal Crump would never forget Deanna. She flashed him a big grin, and she responded, "Mr. Crump, I will make you proud." Deanna was, of course, looking forward to starting 9th grade at Fort Dorchester High School. Most importantly, like many teenage girls, she wanted to have her high school wardrobe on point well in advance to make a good impression. I remember those days. And Deanna loved shoes. A KRS shoe store had recently opened in the mall nearby at the Festival Center, And that's where you would often find her. She would spend her time browsing the many styles and colors for sale. She was there so much, she got to know the store's co-owner, Robin T., who could tell that for Deanna, it was a variation on the theme of being a kid in a candy store. Robin trusted Deanna so much that if she was busy with a customer and Deanna was there, Robin would occasionally have Deanna go fetch shoe boxes from the back room and bring them out to customers to try on. One particular style that had caught Deanna's eye was a pair of bright yellow closed-toe pumps with nearly a 3-inch heel. It was easy to see why Deanna was drawn to these striking shoes, but Robin told her young customer she wouldn't sell them to her without her mom Diane's approval. So on July 9th, before school started, mom and daughter went to the shoe store to go shopping. Deanna was super excited when her mom agreed to let her purchase those yellow pumps that she had been obsessing over. It was going to be the perfect start to the school year. But sadly, no one knew what was about to happen next. In the early hours of the following morning, on July 10th, Archdale Forest resident Scott Morgan awoke to what sounded like a crack of a gunshot. Then he heard a scream and 3 more shots around the apartment complex, just echoing from wall to wall. Scott tried looking out his windows to see what was going on, but they were all fogged up due to the condensation from the air conditioning that he had running through the hot July night. Scott wasn't sure what he had just heard. At the same time, another resident, Matthew Rogers, was watching TV in bed with his fiancée when he heard the same thing, except the gunshots after the scream sounded like they were coming from directly behind Matthew's apartment building. Matthew called 911 at 2:24 a.m. He told the operator he and his fiancée were afraid to look out the window. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves if someone had a gun and was on the loose. Another caller reached out to the police saying that there were gunshots outside of her apartment. Getting a call like this from a neighborhood like this one was actually very unusual. It's known as a safe, quiet community. Dorchester County Sheriff's Deputy Patrolman Adam Smith and Joel Crisp were alerted and soon responded to the location in separate patrol cars. As Deputy Smith made his way onto Shagbark Trail, he kept an eye out for any suspicious vehicles or people that could be fleeing the scene. As he drove around the loop to his left, he saw an apartment door that was open in Building 213, and he could see a light on inside. So he radioed to Deputy Crisp to join him so they could approach the front door of the apartment together. It was apartment 213B. Deputy Smith slowly approached the door from the right, with Deputy Crisp on the left. As the officers moved closer, Deputy Crisp could see inside the apartment. Right away, he saw what appeared to be 2 people lying motionless on the ground inside, and about halfway between the kitchen and the back door. And both of them appeared to have suffered trauma to the head, possibly from a gunshot wound. Given that the resident Matthew Rogers had called 911 reporting gunshots, the deputies had no idea if someone was wielding a gun and they were still inside the apartment. So they held their position and notified other responding units, including emergency medical services, who were quickly on their way. Sergeant Hill and Deputy Buckman soon arrived. Together, the 4 officers went inside the apartment unit. The layout was long and narrow. As they walked into the front door, there was a staircase to their left, and to the right was the kitchen, with a narrow pathway leading into the dining and living room area. The first body that the officers saw as they made their way inside was that of a woman. Then as they moved further into the home, they saw another person lying next to the couch in the living room area. It was the body of a young man lying half on his stomach and half on his right side. There were no signs of life from either of the 2 victims. The officers began to secure and clear the residence. They were satisfied that there was nobody else downstairs, so they made their way up the stairs to where the bedrooms were. That's when they noticed there were 2 young children in one of these rooms, and they appeared to be asleep. But of course, they weren't sure if they were also victims. So the officers moved closer and realized that both of them had been spared. They were just asleep and alive. One was a 5-year-old little girl, and the other was an 18-month-old little boy in his crib, but they were completely unharmed. Deputies Smith and Buckman carried the children downstairs and placed them in a patrol car. Shortly thereafter, the children were taken into custody by the Department of Social Services until other family members could be contacted. And I cannot imagine how traumatizing this would have been for these little children to be woken up by police officers not knowing what was going on. I just kept thinking about those poor babies. Meanwhile, Dorchester County Coroner Chris Nisbet arrived at the scene and unfortunately pronounced both the man and the woman found in the living room dead at the scene. Officers had an idea of who may live in this apartment building based on the mail they found inside, but they weren't 100% sure of the deceased female's identity at this point, nor how the two victims had died. But it appeared they had both been shot in the head. From what they gathered from the mail and speaking with the property manager on the site, the residents who lived there were 44-year-old Diane Grant and 14-year-old Deanna DeVore, and that Diane's young grandchildren were visiting for the summer. At first, the investigators believed that the female lying on the ground in the living room was Deanna, and that Diane wasn't home. Detective Earl Aspel of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office Crime Scene Unit arrived on the scene after being advised that at least one murder had occurred, with the killer possibly taking their own life. This was the assumption, with finding the male and the female inside without an understanding of who these people were. So because that was the working theory at the point, Detective Aspel began taking photographs and processing the apartment for evidence. On the floor near the kitchen counter, he found and collected two .40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casings. A significant amount of blood spatter was on the back of the front door, and this initially suggested that the victims may have been beaten, but the woman victim had a hole in her left cheek that appeared as it was an exit wound, which accounted for that spatter. The bullet had then entered the wall on the right-hand side of the dining room table, 2 feet and 9 inches from the floor, exiting into apartment A next door. So Detective Aspel went to that apartment to ensure no one else was hurt. After the bullet traveled through the wall, thankfully, it lodged itself into a desk drawer and didn't harm anyone else. Crime scene technicians did a gunshot residue test on both bodies. The fact that there didn't appear to be any firearms in the apartment now made it clear that this was not a case where someone shot the woman and then took their own life. No, this was a double murder. The victims were then transported to the coroner's office, and the officers were still unsure of their identities. But whoever had shot the victims had either brought the weapon with them or potentially stolen it from the home. But there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. Someone, perhaps the killer but not the officers, had left shoe impressions of dirt on the floor between the kitchen and the dining room. So Detective Aspel obtained 2 gel lifts of these impressions to see if they could determine the type and size of shoes of the potential killer. A gel lift is a thin film. It's got tacky rubber gel with backing on the other side, and it's placed onto a shoe impression and then peeled up, and it lifts the impression from the floor. Basically, it's a lot like fingerprinting, but for shoes, to determine things like make, style, and size, and sometimes any unique tread marks. From the circular pattern on the ball of the foot and heel in this case, the detective took an educated guess that the shoes were Nike brand Air Force One sneakers or something with a very similar tread design. There were a pair of men's size 10 Nike Air Force One sneakers right next to the couch in the living room, and they seemed to have the same pattern as the shoe impressions on the floor. Both this pair and another pair were taken in for analysis along with the gel lifts. The detectives then took blood swabs and fingerprinted the counter where he could see that somebody had touched it. He also took swabs from the door handles and the dining room table, which had high-velocity blood spatter and some strands of hair on it, which was most likely a result of the shot to Diane's head. Detective John Garrison of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Department arrived, and he was the lead investigator and was assisted by Major Mike Turner and Sergeant Michael Miller. Detective Garrison was surprised to learn that there had been reports of a shooting at Archdale Forest. This wasn't a neighborhood known for violence, let alone shootings. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office and the North Charleston Police Department were also there to assist. Detective Garrison began organizing officers going door to door to find and interview neighbors who had called 911, including Matthew Rogers. They also dispersed out to conduct a general canvass of the entire neighborhood to inquire if anyone had seen or heard anything. While only a couple of 911 calls came in, numerous residents had heard the commotion outside. But the fact that it all occurred in the dead of night meant that none of these residents had actually witnessed anything, nor had they heard any vehicles speeding off. Like other residents, Janice Ament told the officers that she thought that someone was actually setting off fireworks close to the back porch of her apartment. She said that if she thought for a second it was gunshots, she would have actually left her apartment, gone across the street, and got one of her neighbors, who was actually a sheriff's deputy. The complex's on-site property manager spoke to the investigators again, and after a description of the victims was given to her, she explained that the residents of 213B were initially Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna, but by the information provided to her by the detective, she believed that it was most likely the mother, Diane, and the son, Jatavius, that were the victims. But then, where was Deanna? She wasn't in her bed, so was she staying with a friend? Or even worse, what if she had been abducted or somehow involved and was now on the run? These cases really can go in any direction, so officers fanned out across the apartment complex to see if there was any sign of the missing teenager. Tragically, it wasn't until the sun began to rise that investigators would get their answer. Around 6:30 a.m., 2 detectives found the body of a young female lying on the muddy ground behind Building 105 next to an electrical box. She was wearing a tank top, but was naked from the waist down and barefoot. A pair of pajama bottoms with a pair of underwear were inside and placed on top of the electrical box. She was preliminarily identified as 14-year-old Deanna DeVore. The seasoned detectives had seen a lot in their careers, but still, nothing prepares you for seeing something like this. It was just horrendous. They noticed that she had managed to run quite a bit away since Building 105 was separated from Building 213 by a road, a small ravine, and 3 other apartment buildings. They wondered why she was so far from her home, but they theorized that she was, of course, running away from a killer. But also, she could have been trying to get the young children out of harm's way by luring the killer far away from the apartment where the children were sleeping in their beds. She was laying on her side, and it appeared as though she had been shot several times at close range. It also looked like she might have been the victim of a forced sex act due to her clothing being removed. In the grass near her body, there were 4 Federal brand .40 caliber shell casings, and underneath her body were 2 bullets of the same caliber. There were also shoe prints in the ground, which had been disturbed as if there had been a struggle of some kind in that area. As with Diane and Jatavius, the detectives conducted gunshot residue testing on Deanna, and they decided to take cement castings of the shoe prints that were in the mud. Back at the apartment, with the advantage of daylight now, the detectives noticed even more shoe prints in the mud near the front door, and those were also collected. It seemed they had the same sole pattern as the ones that were inside the apartment. Plus, there was a footprint left there as well. At the sheriff's office, the 6 shell casings were processed for latent fingerprints, but none were found. Once there was an official identification made of the 3 victims, the officers had to break the devastating news to Diane's surviving son, Marquise, and his wife, Sonia, down in Florida. Their children were visiting Diane. She'd been caring for them for the past 6 weeks or so. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna had all been killed. It's the most unbelievable and unexpected and heartbreaking news a person can get. That's basically their entire family that had been murdered. Before Marquise even got the call, he was driving at work that morning, just driving along, when suddenly he said that he was overcome with a wave of emotion and just burst into tears. The 25-year-old was confused about why he was feeling that way. It was not like this man to just start crying out of the blue, but he knew that something had to be wrong, but he had no idea what it was. When Marquise arrived back at the office, a detective from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department was there to talk to him. She broke the news to Marquise, who was stunned. 3 of the most important people in his life were dead in a homicide. As Marquise struggled to come to terms with his shock and disbelief, his thoughts quickly turned to his own children. I know that I would be a complete wreck after hearing that news and knowing that my children were in that house. An immense wave of relief washed over him when he was told that his kids were safe and temporarily in the care of social services. There were so many thoughts and emotions for Marquise to process, and his wife Sonia felt exactly the same way when he had to break the news to her. She just kept repeating, "Who would do this? Why? Why?" And then her concern quickly turned to her 2 children. Without hesitating, the heartbroken couple jumped in their car and made the drive to South Carolina. They were still trying to make sense of who could have possibly done something like this to their family. None of them had any enemies. They worked and they studied hard and they lived good, honest lives. Marquise and Sonia weren't the only ones trying to work out what had happened. Diane's ex-husband, Willie, was just as shocked and heartbroken when he learned that his ex-wife and 2 of their children had been gunned down in cold blood. At the same time, Detective Garrison needed to make inquiries as to whether Diane's ex-husband, Willie, knew anything about the slayings because, as we know, it's those closest to the victims who are often involved. Even though Diane and the younger kids had moved away from Gifford, there had still been a marriage that broke down. Even if an ex-spouse isn't involved, they need to be eliminated as suspects. So Willie told investigators he was just as confused as Marquise about who could possibly have done this, who would target his family in such a brutal way, and he flatly denied having any involvement in this crime. Willie claimed he had been in bed at the time of the murders because he had to be at work at 5 a.m., and this was corroborated by others who knew him. Willie knew that if he left the house during that time frame, his own security cameras would show that, and police were ultimately satisfied that he was home the entire night. The State Law Enforcement Division, which is known as SLED, oversaw the autopsies and the collection of evidence from the victims' bodies. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cynthia Shandel conducted 2 of the autopsies, while Dr. Susan Presnell performed the other. Both Diane and Jatavius had each been killed by a single close-range gunshot to the head. Diane was shot in the back right-hand side of her head, with the bullet exiting her left cheek. Jatavius had a laceration due to blunt force injury on the right side of his scalp and a skull fracture underneath. He also had several scrapes on his body. He suffered a close-range gunshot wound through his left cheek, just below his eye, which traveled into his head through his brainstem. The bullet was recovered in 3 fragments from the back of the right side of Jatavius' head. Deanna had been shot at least 4 times at close range, in the face, below her right eye, and in the right side of her neck, and part of the bullet had shot her in the face and it exited the side of her neck next to her jaw. The fatal shot was likely the one to the neck, which immediately shattered her brainstem and her spinal cord. That is just absolutely horrifying. Another gunshot fractured Deanna's upper spine, which, had she have survived, would have meant she would have lived with significant physical impairment and most likely would have not been able to walk again. This is just horrible. Like, who would do this to them? Deanna had also been shot in the upper right part of her back. The bullet exited above her left collarbone and caused bleeding into her left lung. She sustained another gunshot wound to her right shoulder. She clearly sustained more damage than her mother and her brother. Swabs were taken from Deanna's mouth and the lower private areas of her body, and these revealed the presence of semen on her mouth area and on her pajama pants, and they were sent in for testing. However, there was no indication at this time that there had been any penetration of her genital area. As arrangements were being made for Deanna, Jatavius, and Deanna to be laid to rest back in their hometown of Gifford on the evening of July 16th, a vigil was held for them at the Tree of Life Ministries in North Charleston. Among the 175 people that paid their respects and came together to honor the victims were Jatavius' friend Usha Mackey and Diane's former supervisor Anthony Gilliard. On July 18th, just 2 days after what would have been Deanna's 15th birthday, Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones had to say their goodbyes to them at their joint funeral. There were so many people anticipated for that service that it was actually held at the elementary school auditorium. To me, it is always heartbreaking to see more than one casket lined up next to one another. Just a family gone altogether. This was the moment everything became real for Marquise. He would never see his mother again, never see his younger brother and sister, who he'd always fiercely tried to protect. Now, they were gone. And while Marquise was of course beyond thankful that his own children were physically unharmed, there was no denying that things would change forever. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna were all buried at the Mount Zion Cemetery back in Gifford. But Marquise was still scared. If someone could shoot 3 members of his family at close range and apparently force themselves upon his teenage sister, a family who hadn't done anything bad to anyone, then what was stopping them from jumping in their car, heading to Florida to do the same thing to Marquise and his family? No one knew why they were targeted to begin with, but at this stage, law enforcement felt that the victims knew their assailant, but were staying tight-lipped about the investigation. Tia Thomas, whose daughters were good friends with Deanna, told one newspaper that from what she observed, Jatavius was a pleasant young man, but he had supposedly been running around with a rougher crowd lately. Investigators wondered if the killer could have known the family this way. But still, there didn't seem to be a motive. Nothing seemed to be stolen from the apartment, and it seemed Deanna was chased down and then, of course, forced into a sex act. So they needed to dig deeper. As authorities looked back to see if there had been any previous police involvement, they noted that a month before the murders, a neighbor had reported that Diane's grandchildren had actually been left alone in the apartment. Now, Jatavius was supposed to be the one babysitting the kids, which would make sense because Diane was at work. But however, somehow the younger children had accidentally been locked inside of a bedroom in the apartment. Both of the kids were totally unharmed, and a maintenance man had to come and unlock the door. And apparently, the Department of Social Services had to be notified. But there was never anything to follow up on. Still, this incident didn't seem to be related to the murders in any way, and it didn't indicate who the killer would be. The following evening, at a community meeting providing an update on this investigation, Dorchester County Sheriff Ray Nash told a gathering of about 40 concerned residents that at this stage, law enforcement had no reason to believe that this was just a random crime. But they still didn't know what the motive was for the murders, and of course, this did nothing to calm this community. They knew a killer was still on the loose. Among those in attendance were residents of Building 105, where Deanna's body had been found 4 hours after the shooting. They were unhappy that it had taken so long for her body to be found, largely due to the way she had been laid out in the open, exposed all of that time. Nor could they understand why it had taken so long for deputies to find Deanna, given that the 911 calls came from residents in Building 105 itself. Because one caller said she heard gunshots right in the back of her apartment in Building 105. Sheriff Nash explained that until additional units arrived on the scene, the sheriff's office only had 3 or 4 deputies to patrol this entire bigger area of the apartment complex. And at this point, evidence was still being collected and processed. The shoes that had left the impressions on the floor were identified by SLED agent Vicky Hellman as Nike Air Force One sneakers. Detective Aspel had been right. Meanwhile, the .640 caliber shell casings had undergone thorough ballistics analysis and testing by SLED, and there's something that I want to explain quickly here and give you some background. In very basic terms, when a firearm is discharged, the firing pin inside leaves a unique mark on the back of the bullet's shell casing. This means you can not only trace a shell casing to a particular make of a gun, but a specific weapon. Again, this is sort of like fingerprinting, but for guns, and no 2 guns will leave the same mark on the shell casing. They always have their own very minuscule internal imperfections, so it would be impossible for the killer or killers to blame it on any other weapon. For all intents and purposes, all 3 shots looked to have come from identical gun. As the testing was being conducted on the markings on the shell casings of this triple murder, SLED agent Tracy Thrower found that not only had these all been fired from the same weapon, but the markings also matched shell casings from two separate shootings, two other shootings. They were able to figure this out thanks to what's known as the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, which is sort of like CODIS. You know how we look for DNA that's related to other crimes? This system matches shell casings with the same type of markings. The system acts like a screening tool that compares the images to other similar images to find similarities between unconnected cases, or I should say previously unconnected cases. This means that those might end up being related to this triple murder. In Agent Thrower's opinion, the likelihood that another firearm could have produced the type of markings on these shell casings in the three shootings was so rare, it would be practically impossible. This was the first big break in this case. One of the other shootings where the same weapon seemed to have been used was committed at the Anchor Bar and Grill in North Charleston on March 4th, just over 4 months before the DeVore murders. In this previous case, 6 .40 caliber Smith & Wesson casings were found in a parking lot. The other crime with related casings occurred as a drive-by on March 20th at another apartment complex called Hunter Ridge Apartments on Hunter Ridge Lane in Dorchester County. This is off Ashley Phosphate Road, and around 24 shell casings were found on the road following this shooting. Nobody was killed or injured in either of these other shootings, but they did remain unsolved. Still, investigators knew if they could find the person or persons involved in either of those previous shootings, or at least there could be witnesses, this could potentially lead them to whoever killed Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. Not only had no arrests been made in the Anchor Bar shooting, but there were no suspects. So SLED contacted North Charleston PD for their reports on those incidents. And on July 19th, detectives spoke to a bouncer who had been working at the Anchor Bar that night, and his name was Reginald Chavers. According to Reginald, in the early morning hours of March 4th, a man had been kicked out of the bar, which was only 12 miles from the Archdale Forest complex where the DeVore family was eventually killed. Reginald said he saw the patron walk across the parking lot and get into a black pickup truck. The vehicle's front and back passenger window was rolled down. As the pickup pulled away, the man inside picked up a semi-automatic handgun and fired a single shot from the back seat. Someone else sitting in the driver's seat then fired multiple shots using what seemed like a Tech-9 submachine gun. Reginald described the man in the backseat as being a shorter black male, around 5'4" to 5'5" feet tall, about 25 years old with closely cropped hair. Police had already arrested someone for the shooting at the Hunter Ridge Apartments, which was even closer to where Diane's apartment was, less than 4 miles away. His name was Xavier Walker, and he was currently out on bond. Several eyewitnesses who knew Xavier had identified him as one of the 2 shooters at the Hunter Ridge scene, and he was charged. But when investigators went to speak to Xavier about Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's murders, he denied knowing anything about the slayings. He also denied being the shooter at Hunter's Ridge or the Anchor Bar. However, he said that he did have the name of the person who was with him on both of those occasions. But Xavier would only give law enforcement the information if he could have his own charges dropped. Once they struck a deal with him, he said on the night of March 4th, he'd been at the bar with his friend, 25-year-old Anthony Sanders. When Anthony was then kicked out of the bar around 4:30 in the morning, the men got into the pickup truck that Anthony had borrowed from a friend. Anthony was in the driver's seat with Xavier beside him. As they drove through the parking lot, Anthony shot at the bar outside of the window using a semi-automatic handgun. But didn't the eyewitness say that one guy was in the backseat shooting and one was up front? It seems the story is a little bit off, but they let him continue because it's all they had. Xavier then claimed that on March 20th, he'd been in a fight with someone who lived at the Hunter Ridge apartment complex. He said later that day, the same guy that he was with the night at the bar, Anthony Sanders, had picked him up in a vehicle and they drove back to Hunter Ridge together, and there was a shootout. And Xavier claimed Anthony had fired several shots at someone who shot at them first. Of course, that would be the story. Xavier stated that Anthony had used the same weapon on both occasions. It was encouraging that detectives now had another person of interest, but they had no way of knowing whether Anthony was really involved, and if so, to what extent. Was Xavier the killer? And was he just trying to make his friend the scapegoat? They didn't know. But as investigators looked further into Anthony, they learned he was unemployed and he was no stranger to breaking the law. He already had a criminal record for a variety of offenses. In August 2002, Anthony was charged with possession with the intent to distribute drugs and possession with the intent to distribute drugs in the proximity of a school. In January the following year, he was charged with 3 counts of simple assault, but only convicted of one of those. Later that year, he's charged with a DUI and driving while his license was suspended. And in May of 2004, he was charged with driving with a suspended license and possession of drugs. Anthony was born on July 1st in 1982, and he grew up in the Charleston area. He never knew his father, but he had a sister and several brothers, including an identical twin named Tony. Based on Anthony's criminal record, Dorchester County decided that in order to get more information about whether or not he was involved in the DeVore family murders, they were going to initiate a surveillance operation to see whether Anthony would incriminate himself or possibly lead police to the murder weapon. While monitoring him, Anthony was arrested during a traffic stop on July 24th, and they were able to take him in for illegally discharging a firearm in the Hunter Ridge shooting. Following his arrest, Anthony wouldn't say anything to Detectives Garrison and Michael Giglio, which of course was his right, and he asked to speak to an attorney before saying anything further. The detectives had been careful not to mention anything to Anthony about the murders at this stage. As far as Anthony knew, they were only interested in the unsolved shootings from March, and they wanted to see what he would say. Someone who did talk to the investigators, though, was Anthony's girlfriend, Medea Thompson. She had been driving the car when Anthony was arrested during that traffic stop. Medea told officers the couple had been dating for about 3.5 years. While they didn't live together, Anthony often visited Medea where she lived, and guess where that was? In apartment 105D at the Archdale Forest apartment complex. The same exact complex where Deanna, Diane, and Jatavius lived and were found murdered. Is this a coincidence or something more? When asked if she knew anything that happened related to the triple murder, Medea said that on the night of the murders, Anthony came over to visit her, but he didn't stay the whole evening. He left her place around 10 p.m. Police realized that upon Medea giving them her address, this wasn't just the same building where Deanna's body had been found, because Xavier didn't match the description that Reginald had previously given, because he had dreadlocks, not closely cropped short hair. At this same time, Detective Tim Morgan was analyzing Anthony and Xavier's cell phone records from July 6th through 12th. Xavier's phone was turned off from 10:30 p.m. on July 9th, the night before the shootings, and 8:46 a.m. on July 10th. So all through the night, Xavier's phone not on. But Anthony's phone records showed multiple brief calls during the early morning hours of July 10th, with not much of a gap in between. He made a call at 2:05 a.m., then someone called him a minute later. The next outgoing call from Anthony's cell was at 2:24 a.m. to his girlfriend, Medea. You might recall that I mentioned that 2:24 a.m. is the time that the first 911 call came in after the shootings. At 2:25 a.m., Anthony called a female friend of his, Shayla, who lived in a nearby Goose Creek apartment building. They spoke for about 18 minutes. Anthony made another call at 3:24 a.m. to a teenage girl that he knew, who we're going to call Sasha. She lived out in Roanoke, Virginia, but she had lived in North Charleston back in 2006, a year before the murders, and at that time, she had only been 14 years old. And she was in a relationship with Anthony back then, who was 10 years older than her. And that's interesting, considering Deanna was also 14. Anthony had been charged with kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct with a minor in June of 2006 over his involvement with Sasha, but the charges were eventually dismissed. This, of course, piqued the detective's interest. When Detective Garrison went to Virginia to interview Sasha, she said she was actually surprised to get a call from Anthony in the middle of the night. He didn't sound like himself, and during the conversation, he kept repeating that he needed to get out of South Carolina, calling himself a f***up. His words. Sasha said this was very unlike the man that she knew. Anthony also told Sasha that he'd been kicked out of the Anchor bar before a shooting had occurred. There were no phone numbers connected to the victims in the DeVore family in either Anthony or Xavier's phone records. The closest cell tower to the apartment complex was a tower called number 6040, located on Trade Street. This was directly behind Festival Center Mall, which was less than a mile from Diane's apartment building. Detective Morgan could see that outgoing calls from Anthony's cell from 1:38 a.m. to 2:26 a.m. pinged off of Tower 6040. As more phone calls were made from his cell phone between 2:26 a.m. and 2:35 a.m., the phone pinged off of a tower called 6139, which is located on Yolanda Drive. And then at 2:36 a.m., his phone pinged off both towers, 6139 and 6024 at Ashley River Road. These latter towers were ones en route from the apartment complex to the area where Anthony's mom lived in the Forest Hills neighborhood. Based on the cell and ballistics evidence, in conjunction with Xavier naming Anthony as a possible suspect, a search warrant was executed on Anthony's apartment. He lived on Popperdam Creek Drive in North Charleston. All detectives knew for sure so far was that he was linked to the murder weapon and the general area of Archdale Forest at the time of the murders, and not whether he was the one who actually pulled the trigger in the slayings. You'll remember I said that the gel lifts from the shoe impressions at the scene were Nike Air Force Ones. Well, investigators recovered 3 pairs of Nike Air Force One sneakers from Anthony's bedroom, which he shared with his twin brother, Tony. Is it weird? Because I thought it to be odd that the twins were named Anthony and Tony, because it's basically the same name. It's just a thought that crossed my mind. The men slept in single beds, one on each side of the room, and in between there were stacks of about 10 shoeboxes lined up against the wall. The sneakers ranged in sizes from 9 to 11, which I found to be interesting. Didn't know if it was common for men to wear varying size shoes. Just a question, not really that important here. But also inside this bedroom, law enforcement found a black Converse shoebox containing ammunition for a .32 caliber Derringer, as well as 3 Federal brand .40 caliber Smith & Wesson bullets, the same caliber and make as the shell casings from the Anchor Bar and the Hunter Ridge shootings, and the triple homicide. Kind of interesting. Then under Anthony's bed was that .32 caliber Derringer itself, and a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casing manufactured by a company called RP. Investigators also found a safe next to Anthony's bed, and inside were the usual things you would expect to find: photographs, letters, but there was also an arrest warrant and a newspaper clipping from July 12th, which included the story about the brutal DeVore family triple murder. Okay, that's super suspicious. And there were also letters from Sasha, but there was no sign of an actual murder weapon. Detective Garrison then interviewed Anthony's twin brother, Tony, about Anthony's whereabouts on the night of the triple murder. Tony stated that Anthony had stayed with his girlfriend, Medea. He came home briefly around 11 p.m., but he said he later left to go back over Medea's apartment. Tony knew Anthony hadn't come home because Tony had been awake all night and he hadn't seen his brother. When police quizzed Anthony about where the .40 caliber handgun was, he denied ever owning any firearms. And that's when Detective Garrison hit Anthony with the news that if he didn't tell them where the weapon was, he would be charged with 3 counts of murder. They know he's lying because they found ammunition and a firearm at his house. Again, Anthony shut down. He refused to answer any of their questions without speaking to his attorney. We actually don't see this that often, and I would expect this because it's a right to remain silent, but many people don't use that right. By now, the DNA from the semen samples from Deanna's clothing and her body had been run through CODIS, the National DNA Database, to see if there were any matches to any known offenders, and there wasn't. But DNA from semen taken from Deanna's pajama pants revealed a mixed profile from 2 individuals, and investigators hoped that they would soon be able to get a DNA sample from Anthony. What was so atypical about this whole investigation was that instead of a particular suspect being identified first and then cross-checking the forensic evidence, It was the forensic evidence of the gun casings themselves that had led them to Anthony. It's a little bit backwards. On August 2nd, Anthony was charged with the murders of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. But the murder weapon was still missing, and answers as to how Anthony even knew his victims and what his motive was remained unclear. In terms of an alibi, a police affidavit stated that Anthony claimed he was at home on the evening in question, though he later stated he hadn't said this at all. But when Anthony was being escorted to court for his bond hearing, he asked Detective Garrison out of the blue if he'd like to have the gun that was involved in the killings. Detective Garrison obviously said yes, to which Anthony cryptically replied, "One day, I'll tell you what happened." Anthony's bond was denied, and he then remained in custody. Diane's surviving son, Marquise, was incredibly relieved to hear that someone had been charged and was off the streets. But now a different sort of waiting game began until Anthony would have his day in court. It was too early to tell whether a conviction was likely, and the investigation was still ongoing. The day after Anthony was charged, on August 3rd, Detective Garrison interviewed a man named Richard Alexander. Stay with me. Richard had come in to report that his Smith & Wesson semi-automatic .40 caliber handgun and some loose rounds in an ammunition can had been stolen. He told Detective Garrison that in January of 2007, prior to the March shootings, he'd purchased these items, which he kept in the seat of his black Chevy pickup truck. You remember anything now? Richard had first noticed his gun and ammo were gone from his pickup in the days following the murders. And he had what he described as a bad feeling. But he didn't report them as stolen until now. He had no idea how long these items had actually been gone, but it was definitely before the murders. Richard told Detective Garrison that a friend of his, who happened to be named Anthony Sanders, who Richard knew had been charged with the crime, borrowed his pickup truck all the time. Anthony, turns out, was actually Richard's drug dealer, and they had an agreement that if Anthony wanted sometimes, he could give Richard drugs, and in return, Richard would allow him to do things like bring women to his apartment where he could have sex with them in one of his bedrooms, or he could borrow his truck in exchange for drugs. Now, officers didn't seize a can of ammunition in the original search of Anthony's apartment, and they couldn't even recall seeing one. But when they looked back at photographs that they took in Anthony's bedroom, they saw a can matching the description of the one that Richard said had been stolen. So a second search warrant was executed, and they seized this can. Now, Richard couldn't say if it was the exact same one that he was missing, but it definitely looked like it. Richard also told Detective Garrison that following the triple murder, Anthony had actually asked him if he knew anything about DNA. Richard told Anthony that police can get DNA from saliva, blood, or semen, to which Anthony then asked him whether it would matter if a condom had been used. And then the conversation ended. And then Richard was left wondering whether Anthony might have committed some kind of sex offense. And if that's not telling, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, detectives went back to the Archdale Forest Apartments with a picture of Anthony to see if any of Diane's neighbors would recognize him. And not only did some of the neighbors recognize Anthony, but they told officers that they'd seen him prior to the murders talking to Deanna while she was hanging out with her friends in the area. Yikes. It seems like this is all starting to come together. On August 30th, Anthony was indicted by a Dorchester County grand jury for 3 counts of murder. The charges against his friend Xavier over the Hunter Ridge shooting were dropped in exchange for Xavier's cooperation. Of course, Anthony pleaded not guilty, and he was actually facing the death penalty if he got convicted. From what investigators could tell from his upbringing, Anthony did come from a really tough background. And while he had family around him, including his mother Patty and his sister, his older brothers were said to be a bad influence. Anthony had been close to his mother, but she sadly passed away suddenly the year before from complications following childbirth. And that, of course, scares the heck out of me because I am pregnant right now, and I know that is a real risk, and it's very sad. But despite these struggles, Anthony was said to be doing the best he could on his own with his young son. And it seemed like he truly wanted to maintain a healthy relationship with him and be a present father. It was his mother's passing that made Anthony realize he needed to step it up and be an active part of his son's life. But it wasn't long before Anthony began abusing drugs and alcohol. In addition to drinking heavily, Anthony was involved in experimenting with psychotropic drugs, including ecstasy and dealing crack. In the meantime, Anthony's DNA had been collected and it had been tested against what was found on Deanna's body and her pajama pants, as well as the front doorknob of the apartment. And SLED agent Katie Coy identified a partial DNA profile obtained from the semen of Deanna's oral swabs that matched Anthony. The match was around 1 in 260. This meant that there were only a 1 in 260 chance that the DNA belonged to Anthony. So this wasn't as encouraging as investigators might have hoped for, because in many criminal cases, DNA results are usually much more significant. At the time, SLED didn't conduct DNA testing for male profiles using this test called a YSTR test, which identifies the Y chromosome. So the sample was sent to be run by another lab, a private lab. However, he was excluded as a contributor for the semen that was detected on Deanna's pajama pants, as well as the DNA found on the apartment doorknob. And that makes things confusing, but I think it's safe to say that he had an encounter with Deanna, and it doesn't appear to have been consensual. And then she ended up dead from a weapon he was in possession of. On July 16, 2008, First Circuit Solicitor David Pascoe announced that the state would be pursuing the death penalty. By now, the solicitor's office had established that aggravating circumstances justified this sentence. In Anthony's case, he'd killed more than one person and had committed these murders in conjunction with a burglary and criminal sexual conduct. The latter offense was well established by the presence of Anthony's DNA on the oral swabs. The public still didn't know what happened to Deanna beyond David Pascoe just saying that it was, quote, absolutely horrendous, end quote. Still, there was no mention of a motive. The announcement about the death penalty gave Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones a pause. A cousin of the family, Chantel Miller, who had always been opposed to the death penalty, now said it hit so close to home and was so personal that she's had a lot to process. And she said if he's found guilty, she wouldn't be against the death penalty. And yes, people do change their minds when something happens to them or someone they love. It makes you look at things differently. But by now, the first anniversary of the murders had come and gone. Chantel and another cousin, Nadine Ballard, visited the graves of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna to plant a rose bush and tie 3 balloons to Deanna's grave in honor of her 16th birthday, which she would have celebrated that month. Pretrial hearings didn't even get underway until over a year later in November 2009. The prosecution now offered to forego the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea, which would carry the reduced sentence of life in prison without parole. Anthony initially seemed to think this was going to be something he was going to go along with, but at the last minute, the man changed his mind. At a subsequent hearing, a status conference had significant implications on how Anthony's trial would unfold. The state was now offering not to pursue the death penalty in exchange for Anthony waiving his rights to a jury trial. If a judge found Anthony guilty, he was instead looking at 30 years to life in prison for each indictment. Sometimes I do get mad when these kind of deals are offered. But this course of action was initiated in consultation with Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's family. They knew that even if Anthony were found guilty, the appeal process would be so long, and it just wasn't something that they thought they could handle. It could go on for decades, so fair enough. Even though this might sound like a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of avoiding the death penalty, a bench trial isn't without risks. Instead of a jury, an accused person may encounter a judge who is known for a high rate of convictions or harsh sentences. And unlike when you have a jury trial, the judge is privy to every single piece of evidence. You know how sometimes in cases we get frustrated because certain things are held back from the jury and we're like, I wish they would have known that. Well, the judge would. And as far as Anthony's attorneys were concerned, they felt a bench trial was in his best interest. A lot of times, it's really hard to find potential jurors who are opposed to the death penalty. Anthony's attorneys also thought a bench trial would be better for their client, given the weakness, in their opinion, of the DNA evidence. They felt like a judge would be able to assess this aspect of the case better than a jury would. So Anthony's attorneys signed what they call a waiver, and Anthony was questioned by the judge during a very lengthy hearing. He was asked things like whether he understood this waiver. He said he did. He was willing to sign it to avoid the death penalty, so it was approved. So now 28-year-old Anthony's trial got underway on March 8th, 2010, so many years later, at the Dorchester County Courthouse in St. George, and he stood before Circuit Judge R. Markley Dennis Jr. The prosecution's case was presented, and it was that in the early morning hours of July 9th, 2007, Anthony, who was armed with a handgun, gained access to the DeVore family's apartment with the sole intent of forcing Deanna to engage in a sex act. They believe she was forced to take off her pajama bottoms and her underwear at gunpoint and proceeded to give him oral sex. But at some point before intercourse could begin, Diane and Jatavius either arrived home or were already in the apartment and were awoken. Anthony was most likely caught off guard, and to eliminate any threat to him, he shot Jatavius in the face, and then as Diane ran for the door, Anthony shot her in the back of the head. It is just disgusting to think about. Deanna, having just witnessed her mother and her brother being murdered, she ran from the apartment barefoot, clutching her pajama pants and her underwear, and as she fled, Anthony chased her down. And it just so happened he caught up to her right in the back of his own girlfriend's apartment, where he then shot the teen dead. After Deanna fell to the ground, Anthony shot her 3 more times before fleeing the area, calling his girlfriend Medea as he drove away. I cannot even begin to imagine how absolutely terrifying this must have been for Deanna as she was running for her life. Not only had she just been violated, but she witnessed the murder of her mother and brother. She was desperately trying to get away. The sheer terror that she must have experienced is unimaginable. And it's unthinkable to me that a man would kill a young girl over pleasure, but it's so common, as most of you know. It's just disgusting. And it doesn't even matter that Anthony had a girlfriend that he could have easily had sexual relations with. That's not the point. They want what they can't have. They enjoy the chase and forcing women into these unspeakable things, all in the name of control and getting off. It's beyond me how their brains work. The state was open about the fact that there were no eyewitnesses or any solid evidence that Anthony had previously known Diane, Jatavius, or Deanna. The prosecution case against Anthony was purely circumstantial, but this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Circumstantial evidence can be both powerful and compelling. The evidence in its totality was what pointed to Anthony's guilt. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the 18-minute period when no calls were made or received on his cell phone just before the murders, with the prosecutor saying that it cannot be explained away as a coincidence that there's no phone activity while all these other actions are going on. Anthony's sneakers were the same size and type as the shoe impressions, and the bullets found in his home matched in caliber and brand with the shell casings found at the scene. But the most condemning piece of evidence of all was what was in Anthony's safe. If he wasn't guilty, there was no explanation for him to have saved a newspaper article about the triple homicide. It was a memento. The other items in the safe, such as photographs and letters, were also little mementos of his previous crimes. Anthony also had ample opportunity to steal the gun from his friend Richard, whose pickup truck he regularly borrowed. And the shell casings in his bedroom matched the ones found at the Anchor bar shooting, which Anthony had been connected to. I mean, it all adds up in my mind. One of the pieces of evidence on the side of the defense, though, was that none of Anthony's sneakers could be definitively matched to the shoe impression found at the scene. While his sneakers were the same size and type as the one that left the impressions, SLED agent Vicky Hallman found the gel lifts were consistent with all Nike Air Force One sneakers of that type and size. Basically, what she testified was that Air Force Ones or sneakers with similar tread design accounted for about 95% of her cases. It was a very popular shoe type. So the defense said it wasn't conclusive as to whether Anthony's shoes were the ones that left those impressions. The defense also said that the fact that the DNA from Deanna's oral swabs wasn't a high statistical match was another aspect of reasonable doubt. The fact that investigators didn't appear to pursue Xavier as aggressively as they did Anthony was also raised. But Xavier had been subsequently charged and denied bond in another murder that occurred after Anthony was arrested. So that being said, the defense claimed that this was inadequate investigation, and Anthony chose not to testify in his defense. On March 9th, Judge Dennis found Anthony guilty of all 3 counts of murder. And before he was sentenced, Diane's cousin, Carolina Anderson, addressed the court. She gave a moving statement as to the anguish and pain the murderers left in their wake, saying, quote, "I'd like to speak on behalf of the Grant family and the DeVores. This was a family that never bothered anyone. I knew Diane. We worked together for the past 9.5 years of her life, and I really got to know her. She made sure she got the job done regardless. The boss could tell her things, and there was nothing that she would say. She would walk away. She wouldn't harm a fly. She was always a sweet, kind, loving person, very quiet. She loved to laugh, and she loved to eat and have a good time with her family. Deanna helped me with being able to read and go on with school. Deanna was a sweetheart. I don't understand why these things happen, and I know that God's will has to be done. I assume that this was God's way of saying, come on home, but the way that it was done, we may never know what or why. All we can do is ask that you bring justice. I didn't just lose a first cousin and a coworker. I lost a good friend. This is a tight-knit family. Diane was so happy-go-lucky. For the first time in her life, she was going to meet her brother, whom she had never seen before. I thank God he spared his children, that Marquise wasn't around. No matter what you say here today, it won't bring them back. But if some justice can be served on behalf of this, our family can get closure. We will really appreciate it. And you do what you have to do, but we appreciate what you do and ask for justice for our family, end quote. The prosecutor asked for Anthony to be sentenced to nothing less than the maximum of 30 years to life in prison without parole, emphasizing that Jatavius and Diane had both been shot at close range, in the face and then the back of the head. Judge Dennis sentenced Anthony to life without parole on all 3 counts. The tipping point requiring the maximum sentence, according to the judge, was Anthony chasing Deanna down. She had been hunted down like an animal after she fled the apartment. She ran into the night, desperately hoping someone would come to her rescue. But before they could, she was murdered and left out in the open for hours without dignity. Anthony had nothing to say during the sentencing. As far as the prosecution, the defense, and the victims' families were concerned, there was still no definite answers as to how Anthony knew this family or what his motive was, but I think we can kind of put 2 and 2 together. Based on the available evidence, the prosecution and the investigators believe that from Anthony seeing Deanna around the complex when he was there visiting his girlfriend, Medea, he had ran into Deanna and possibly even struck up a conversation in the weeks leading up to her death. She was very outgoing, we know that much, but Anthony had bad intentions. He decided he wanted her, and nothing was going to stop him. The more he saw her around, the more his urge grew, stronger and stronger. And finally, the night he was over at Medea's, the urge was just too strong. And in the early morning hours of July 10th, Anthony knocked on the front door of Diane's apartment. At that point, Diane and Jatavius weren't home. And maybe he knew this by having watched the apartment in the weeks leading up to the murders. But Deanna was home. She was babysitting her niece and nephew, who were already safely tucked into their beds. So Deanna opened that front door, and Anthony threatened her at gunpoint. He forced his way inside, and he subjected a terrified Deanna to a forced sexual act upstairs. And then her mother and brother arrived home. Anthony went back downstairs and first shot and killed Jatavius and then Diane. And we know Deanna then fled downstairs half naked out the front door holding her pajama pants and underwear before Anthony chased her down and shot her behind building 105. We know that Deanna had not only tried to escape, but in leaving the house, she led Anthony outside away from her niece and nephew who were peacefully sleeping upstairs. In doing so, she saved their lives. We don't know what this man would have done. Anthony did attempt to appeal based on grounds of ineffective counsel, but this was dismissed. Almost 8 months later, on January 6, 2011, Anthony filed for application for a post-conviction relief. This was also dismissed, but this did not deter Anthony. He applied to the Supreme Court of South Carolina in June of 2015, and the court granted him an evidentiary hearing. In October of 2018, which wasn't that long ago, the court found that Anthony did in fact receive ineffective assistance of counsel. At this point, he said he would have never signed that waiver. He only signed it because his attorneys told him it wasn't enforceable. I don't know why they would tell him that, but this is what he claimed. Now, due to the impact of the pandemic at the time, it resulted in so many backlogs in the court system that this evidentiary hearing wasn't held until 2 years later in 2021. It was then more than another 2 years before the First Judicial Circuit Court granted Anthony a belated direct appeal, despite finding that Anthony knowingly and voluntarily waived his right to a jury trial. However, his request for a new trial was denied, thankfully. I want to end with the aftermath. In March of this year, 2024, Anthony appealed his conviction. He claimed the evidence merely raised a suspicion that he was involved in the murders and not that he committed them. And therefore, this is grounds for an acquittal and a new trial. At the time of me recording this, the South Carolina Court of Appeals is yet to issue a ruling. And of course, this gives me chills in a bad way. 41-year-old Anthony continues to reside at the Lee Correctional Institute in South Carolina, and I cannot imagine the ongoing pain and uncertainty and anguish that this is causing all of this family's loved ones. Instead of being able to move through their overwhelming grief and process the loss day to day, they're now facing not just the possibility that Anthony may be acquitted and even ordered a new trial, but if he's again found guilty, he may receive the death penalty, a sentence that the DeVore and Grant families never wanted to begin with. And this will trigger years and years of further appeals. But this is our legal system, and I do respect it nonetheless. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's families understandably remain shattered till this day over the loss of 3 people who they loved very deeply. Deanna's heroism in making that split-second decision to flee the apartment after being violated in the most intimate way possible saved the lives of her niece and nephew. This is a testament to the kind of selfless person she was and how far she would go to protect her family. Values which were instilled in her by her mother and her older brothers. Marquise and his wife Sonia know that Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna live on in how Diane's grandchildren are being raised in a way that honors the closeness, warmth, and unconditional love that Marquise will never forget as being the heart and soul of his mother's home. Thank you so much for watching this video and being here for Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's story. I will see you in my next one. Bye.